Hi everyone. My name is Kevin Mayer. I'm from Forescout Technologies, and I want to talk a little bit today about something possibly not as scary and outlandish and as exciting as what we've heard, but I think just as important. That being said, I don't want us to forget about all the exciting stuff that we've heard about IoT, and I'll circle back to that a little bit. So we've spoken a lot to our customers, our healthcare customers, about what's actually their greatest concern. And when we talk to the CISO side of the house, we ask them, what are you actually worried about? These are the numbers that we get. Now, you might think, well, why isn't patient safety the greatest worry? Because after all, it's a hospital. Hospitals look after patients and they're trying to make patients better. So one thing to keep in mind here is most of our customers are in America. Not to say that Americans aren't nice people, but in hospitals in America also all about making money. And what makes money? Having patients and treating patients and keeping their data safe. So hackers typically go for data. They don't go as much for patients. Not to saying they wouldn't go for patients, but they typically go for data because data sells really well. A typical patient record can sell on the black market for hundreds of dollars. And if you think about taking children's patient records, it's worth even more, because think about the fact that until the child becomes 18 and learns about their own identity and what's happened to it, many years, and much fraud has been conducted in the meantime. So data breach is still a very important issue facing these people. When we look at where they're worried about the risk, so they see half of the risk essentially coming from IoT and medical devices. And I'm putting that in a similar category at the moment because there are similar challenges around them. Like IoT, many medical devices, they're not like computers where you can take them home, update the antivirus, do whatever you want to them, unless you're a hacker, of course. But most hospitals won't do that. Most hospitals will take the vendor's recommendations of what to patch, when to patch, what update to put on, and the fact that it's running Windows XP, well, it's running Windows XP, not much they can do about it. Same sort of thing with IoT. And I think with Windows XP it comes across also with legacy Windows devices. So everyone is worried about having legacy Windows devices in the network, but this is much more prevalent in healthcare than many other industries because of the fact that much of the devices in healthcare, they have a very long lifespan, 10, 20, 25 years. They'll be in the hospital, continue being used, and because they still perform their job, they still perform the healthcare function that they were bought to perform. And so this is really quite a significant risk that they see there. This website is a very cool website if you like to see the troubles that other people have and realize that your troubles aren't as bad as other people. Called the Wall of Shame. It's run by the Department of Health and Human Services in the US. Any healthcare provider or HDO in the US that experiences a breach of more than 500 records containing protected health information is obliged to report it to the authorities, and it gets put up on this Wall of Shame. In the first 5 months of this year, there were 169 breaches reported. We'll see here, this column is basically the number of records in each breach. I've sorted by size here. So you see it's not just 500, 600, it's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even over 1 million. And where the breach occurs, it's the same as we've seen for decades, actually. The breaches are typically on network servers, emails, stolen laptops, etc. It's the common mistakes, the common bad security that we've always seen, we're still seeing in healthcare environments. We saw a diagram similar to this with Oren a few moments ago. A typical hospital or typical healthcare network environment should look something like this. And this more or less shows all the different devices you'd find on the network. What's different here to most industries is that apart from the campus IT, facilities, IP telephony, etc., there are quite a few different groups of equipment which might have their own procurement centers, managed independently, and are always about function over security, where those who procure them need to use them, and cybersecurity will come in as an afterthought. So the big question is, what do we do about them? That being said, this end goal of having a nicely drawn up and logical network like this is not something we see a lot of. We see everything from totally flat networks to networks with dozens of great segmented VLANs, but the device is still all over the place and not necessarily in the correct VLANs. So there's a long way to go for many healthcare providers. And this problem is only getting worse. Again, all industries are experiencing this. The explosion of IoT, we heard before, 20 to 25 billion IoT devices around the world at the moment. This problem is getting worse with time. The hockey stick curve is hitting healthcare a little bit later because of the long lifespan of healthcare equipment, but the explosion's there. And if you look at the most common devices, healthcare devices at the moment, it's connected ones, it's infusion pumps and real-time location tracking systems. Over time, we expect this to be more and more devices that are actually touching the patient, and that's something to be concerned about. So what are the issues? What are the big issues that we have to look at? So I'm going to narrow down a little bit on Windows. Again, it's not about Microsoft bashing, because if we look at latest versions of Windows, really the same problems aren't there, or not as bad as they were. But again, because of this long lifespan of medical devices, we obviously see a high proportion of really old Windows devices in hospitals, be it Windows XP, Windows 2000. It's really not uncommon to see them. But I think what's especially scary is not the old devices like Windows XP that we're seeing, but this number of 71%. That's 71% of the Windows devices on healthcare networks at hospitals, and Windows is clearly the majority. So 71% of those devices are running versions of Windows which by early next year are not going to be supported by Microsoft anymore. So they're going to fall into the same category that Windows XP and 2000 fall into now. So what's going to happen then? What are the hospitals going to do? And again, it's not like even now when Microsoft releases a patch, can they necessarily go download that patch and update it straight away? Because typically they'll get their patches from the vendors, but that option's there. The vendors are encouraged to adopt the patch and pass it on to the hospitals. So this is a big concern. On the right-hand side, I just mentioned the different protocols that we see floating around the network. It's not that communication's bad or SMB is bad because files need to be transferred. DICOM is super important. All the images for X-ray machines, CT scanners, etc., need to be transferred around. But what's scary about this is that it's not just a secure version of SMB. We see a lot of SMB v1, version 1, floating around. This is a protocol which is, I think, about 30 years old by now. Definitely not designed with security in mind. Of course, we see Telnet. We're seeing more SSH, but we see SSH and we still see a lot of default credentials used. I mean, we had an example of that before with a consumer toy, but it's not unusual to see default credentials being used in enterprise environments as well. So the point of this is that we have to be careful with what we're seeing then, and we have to take these basic measures to deal with this. I mean, DICOM we have to use, but it can be secured. So let's move towards securing it, even if it means adopting the newer technology, putting safeguards in place in the meantime. So there are a couple of points I want to make about the moral here, and I'll explain how this applies in reality afterwards. So one is to be concerned about the network, not just about the devices on the network, not just the IoT devices, but the network itself. What's the structure of my network? What access does it have outside? What outside access is there inside? This is, again, the same type of mantra that we've heard for 20 years in cybersecurity. Still be concerned about the devices, all the devices. Yes, the IoT devices are important. Yes, the computers are important. The printers are important. Understand everything that's there and deal with each type of device appropriately. The approaches that we had for traditional Windows devices don't apply to IoT devices and don't necessarily apply to medical devices. So we need to deal with each type of device appropriately. And the last part I wanted to make is that hackers don't always go directly for the crown jewels. They'll use the weak spot to get in, and they'll move laterally as needed. So if you're only securing your IoT, they'll come in through the IT devices. If you're only securing your IT, they'll come in through the IoT devices. It's not a question of securing one part, it's really securing everything. So what can we actually do? Firstly, know what there is on the network. So understand all these different parts of the network, what IoT you have, and what the limitations are, what the vendor limitations are, what the regulatory limitations are, what can you do to actually deal with any security risks there. And by that I mean your normal Windows devices, patch them, keep them up to date, maintain basic hygiene on your computers, because that's always going to be important. And where you can, maintain that same hygiene on IoT devices. If it's an IoT device from a manufacturer that allows you to patch the Windows, that allows you to run antivirus or APT tools on it, do so. If it's not possible and you put in a corner by the vendor, then the vendor needs to be pressurized to give you that support. Lastly, segmentation. One thing we can do in the meantime is maintain a well-segmented network. It's something which is super important, but it's something that's important to not do just once. Doing this just once is great for the day you've done it, but the next day a new device comes on, a new infusion pump. Doctors have to move devices to different plugs. You don't want to be you don't want to be the patient when the doctor says, I need to move this device to a different port, but hang on, I need to fill in the cybersecurity form and email it in before they'll allow me to plug it into the new port. You want all that to work seamlessly. So look, microsegmentation is obviously the ultimate goal. You know, a perfectly segmented network where each device has just the access it needs. But in reality, most organizations are still a number of years away from this. As I said, some still have totally flat networks here. So it's a question of starting where you can and doing what you can in incremental steps. Any sort of improved security, it's not something that's going to come overnight, and it's not something that can be attacked all at once. It's about starting with the high-risk devices, the high-risk parts of your network, and taking it step by step. So what does that mean practically? Start segmenting. Do protection on the outside. If you don't have good protection between yourself and the outside network, you need some of that. Again, this is old technology, but it's something which still isn't implemented well in many organizations. North-South segmentation is super important. Devices that need to access the data center should be given the access they need to the data center. Those that don't shouldn't have access. And of course, the east-west segmentation. Lateral movement is really a fairly simple thing to do once someone's got access to a network. And we know that some devices are going to be vulnerable. We know that we can't always fix those vulnerabilities ourselves or do it right away. So one thing we can do is try and make that lateral movement as hard as possible. Again, it's not going to make it impossible, but it makes it harder. This is just an interesting statistic showing the number of different VLANs that we see on healthcare networks. The fact that we see a lot with just one VLAN, these are the totally flat networks, is interesting in itself. But at the other end of the scale, the number of over 100 VLANs in a healthcare network, one can only imagine what sort of management nightmare that is. But what's worse about this is that not only is it a management nightmare, but the devices aren't necessarily all in the correct VLANs. We've seen examples of hospitals where the doctor's iPads, where they take their notes, they jump back and forth between the hospital network and the guest Wi-Fi. Maybe iPads are safer, but think if they were Windows tablets and what sort of malware they'd be bringing back and forth from the guest Wi-Fi. Or on the radiology network, things which have got nothing to do with radiology plugged into that network. So this is really a slow-moving task, but something that really we have to attack to move forward. So what I'm really trying to say here is that there's some things we can do, some things we have control over about the devices themselves. Where we don't, we can put pressure, but we have to work around it. We have to deal with the network. We have to try to solve it within the network as much as we can. So thank you for your time. What I just want to leave you with is that there are tons of new threats. The Internet of Things really is bringing tons of new risks, new vulnerabilities and new threats that we do need to be concerned about. But that being said, we mustn't forget about the old ones. They're all still there. Thanks.